Hello, everyone. Today, we will step into a world full of mystery and pride medieval castles. Thick walls, towering watchtowers, and intricate designs were not only symbols of power, but also the result of genius intelligence honed through war, plague, and other life threatening challenges. In this video, you will explore the secrets that made ancient architects proud and understand why these castles still stand tall today. If you want to dive deep into history and witness humanity's timeless craftsmanship, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any discoveries. And don't forget, share where you're watching from because I really want to know how far this history loving community spreads. When medieval castles began to rise across Europe, they were not the romantic ruins we often see today in movies or on Instagram. They were symbols of power, defense, and sometimes the only way for a lord to assert that peace had been left behind. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the continent sank into chaos. Looting, revenge, and poor living conditions turned the land into a place full of uncertainty. Whoever had a sword wanted land, and whoever had land wanted walls. It was in this context that the Motte and Bailey architecture emerged wooden fortresses built on artificial hills surrounded by wooden fences. It was fast, cheap, and truly effective. The wood was built high enough to slow the enemy's advance while creating a barrier strong enough to protect those inside. But wood also came with obvious drawbacks. It was flammable, prone to rot, and often could not withstand strong winds or unexpected enemy probing. Occasionally, even a vicious goose could perform castle defense more effectively. Wooden fortresses, though designed to be temporary, often lasted only a few years before being destroyed by fire or weather. Then a revolutionary idea appeared. If a castle were built of stone, it would withstand all dangers, from fire to brutal invasion. Stone does not burn, does not rot, and looks majestic enough to command respect from any peasant. However, stone was far from cheap, and building enormous castles from this material required a large team of masons, engineers, and laborers. A stone castle could take decades to complete, but for most medieval lords, this was not an issue. They did not intend to move. They built to assert power, status, and long-lasting wealth. Once completed, these castles became the ultimate symbol, an architectural declaration of who the territory belonged to, and that perhaps God was blessing its owner. The Normans were masters at turning strategy into aesthetic power. After invading England in 1066, they built a series of castles across the territory, sometimes merely to mark ownership, sometimes to assert authority over the local populace. Within a century, there may have been over 1,000 stone castles, all sending the same message: welcome to the feudal system where power is supreme. The earliest castles might have been ugly, inconvenient, with windows smaller than modern phone screens and no plumbing system, but their defensive effectiveness was absolute. They existed to protect, to display strength, and to make any invader think twice before advancing. But even when strategically perfected, castles were also places to flaunt power. A tall tower, thick wall, or imposing main gate was a way to tell the world, I am wealthy, intelligent, and slightly paranoid. In an era without social media, the only way to show superiority was to carve it into the landscape. Lords competed not only on defense but also on appearance, status, and making the people look up every day. Some castles were built on harsh terrain, swamps, or hillsides, not because it was convenient for living, but because it looked impressive from afar. Functionality was sometimes secondary to visual impact. Lords did not build merely to survive sieges, but to create works of art in stone, monuments expressing power, intelligence, and pride. Inside, rooms were heavily guarded, corridors and staircases designed to control every movement, as suspicion towards servants was commonplace. Construction was extremely harsh. No precise drawings, no computers, only experience, measurement, and estimation. Apprentices had to hold plumb lines in the rain, hauling each stone up steep hillsides, while master masons coordinated all the work. Every stone placed correctly was not only a step in architecture, but also a declaration of power. Castles were no longer temporary shelters. They were the ultimate status symbols, where every wall and watchtower sent a clear message. You can see me, but you will never reach me. Hills or elevated positions were not just for defense, they were psychological weapons. Every step up the slope for an invader was a challenge, a warning. Medieval lords understood that controlling the view meant controlling power. From below, the castle was majestic and impregnable. From above, it was damp, windy, yet still a monument of authority. Nothing conveyed maximum protection and clear power more than wide, water-filled moats or sharp spikes. In theory, they were excellent defensive tools. In practice, they were often dirty, muddy, and full of mosquitoes, but still enough to make attackers reconsider. Some dry moats contained creative obstacles, from stones and spikes to other barriers, all aimed at increasing the risk for any assailant. Every element of medieval castle architecture was both strategic and a statement of power, and sometimes a source of obsession for the builders. And it was precisely these seemingly minor details, a moat, a tall wall, a sturdy stone gate, that transformed medieval castles from temporary fortresses into masterpieces enduring through time, symbols of power, wealth, and exceptional intelligence. They did not merely withstand enemies, they resisted oblivion, leaving us captivating stories of skill, strategy, and ambition from the medieval world. If a water-filled moat is a psychological warning, then the main castle gate is the full theater of the medieval era. Not merely an entrance, the gate was a stage where invaders recognized the superior power and defensive intelligence of the castle's owner. From the very first glance, soaring towers, fluttering flags, drawbridges stretched as if inviting, and sunlight glinting off the stone made one feel warmly welcomed. But just minutes later, the invader would realize that this courtesy was a trap. The gate was designed to feel inviting, but in reality, it was a narrow corridor leading straight to death. From murder holes above, stones, boiling oil, or heavy objects were dropped. Along the corridor were arrow slits, where archers turned the tight space into an invisible killing machine. The sophistication did not stop at danger. Some gates were designed with multiple layers of portcullises and secondary drawbridges, forcing invaders to climb, observe, and maintain their pride simultaneously. Even spots where boiling oil occasionally fell doubled as living quarters for guards. A design both dangerous and practical, the gate became a symbol of defensive genius, where attackers learned humility and defenders had front row seats to witness a display of power. Next, the spiral staircase, one of the most ingenious yet devious medieval creations. They not only saved space, but also served strategy. Most spiraled clockwise, hindering the right hand of attackers, while defenders above could swing freely. Each uneven step was calculated to trip hasty climbers. Some towers reversed the spiral to mislead invaders, creating a terrifying, confusing experience, but with absolute effectiveness. These staircases were not merely design, they were psychological warfare carved in stone. Arrow slits were another testament to timeless defensive intelligence. Outwardly, they appeared as narrow gaps, flimsy as paper, but inside they expanded to allow archers to shoot while remaining hidden from the enemy. One person could release dozens of arrows with near-perfect accuracy, while invaders were constrained in space and sight. As weapon technology advanced, arrow slits were refined, cross-shaped for crossbows, round for early firearms, and angled designs to shield key approaches. Medieval architects did not just build walls, they created an interactive experience of despair for attackers. Of course, all this came with side effects. Castles were dark, cold, and cramped. Sunlight was rarely welcome to avoid revealing positions. Inside, you bumped into walls, furniture, or other people before noticing their presence. Yet a small group of archers could hold off an entire army, protected by geometry, physics, and skilled craftsmanship. Some castles even used fake arrow slits to give the impression of greater firepower, making besiegers hesitate. Another factor contributing to psychological power was narrow staircases combined with uneven steps. Each step was a potential hazard. For defenders, it was a strategic advantage. For invaders, fatigue, pain, and frustration. Even wider steps were not comfortable. Servants and soldiers had to transport heavy loads, food, armor on these medieval machines, always facing the risk of slipping, injury, or worse. It was a unique blend of mathematics, physics, and psychological warfare. Not only staircases, but small details like windows or vents also had strategic purposes. Narrow wall slits were not for sunlight, but for archers to shoot volleys of arrows while remaining nearly invisible to enemies. Walls were designed to maximize defensive efficiency. Invaders shot thousands of arrows at the stone with almost no effect, while archers inside returned fire with high accuracy, making the outside space hopeless. This was the ultimate effectiveness of medieval architecture. One person, one slit, and dozens of invaders rendered powerless. With the development of siege technology, arrow slits evolved from cross shaped for crossbows, round for primitive firearms, to angled slits protecting key approach routes. Architects did not merely build walls, they designed an interactive experience of despair for those daring to attack. This system reminds us that medieval castles were not just shelters or showpieces. They were coordinated, sophisticated, and ruthless mechanisms where every stone, step, and slit was calculated to maximize the owner's advantage. Thus, a castle was not merely architecture, it was strategic art, a stage for power, and an enduring lesson on how humans combined intelligence, physics, and psychology to protect and assert status. They depict a world where every detail, no matter how small, had a reason to exist, and where design genius and ruthlessness sometimes blended to perfection. If the fortress is the cold heart of the castle, then the corridors, great halls, and towers are its continuous beats, both lively and terrifying. Each wall, each staircase, and each opening is not just an architectural object, but a story of power, fear, and the clever tactics of the medieval era. Corridors twisted like mazes, narrow and only wide enough for one person, forced invaders to move in line at the precise pace dictated by the stones and defensive mechanisms. Above, towers with trapdoors and murder holes were ready to crush anyone daring to approach. Gravity became an ally, and any heavy object could turn into a deadly weapon. The Great Hall, the center of daily life and power, was a place of harmony between danger and everyday chaos. It served as a dining room, a courtroom, a party center, and sometimes even a temporary battlefield. Dogs, servants, guards, and guests jostled and collided constantly, creating a mixture of sound, smell, and sensation that was both lively and oppressive. The fire in the hearth warmed only a few feet around it, leaving those farther away to endure biting cold. Kitchen smoke drifted throughout the hall, mingling with the scent of damp stone and burning wood, creating a space that would feel suffocating to the modern eye, yet symbolized power and resilience. Meanwhile, bedrooms and personal living areas rarely offered comfort. Low temperatures, cramped spaces, and lack of privacy made daily life a constant challenge. Towers, serving both as guard posts and living quarters, reflected the Lord's paranoia. Every corner was monitored, and the loyalty of subordinates had to be verified through both actions and watchful eyes. Transporting food, armor, and essential supplies through narrow corridors, spiral staircases, or up tall towers was an exercise in endurance, intellect, and dexterity, while also a reminder that in a castle, power came hand in hand with persistent inconvenience. Amenities such as toilets or drainage systems were also evidence of the frighteningly effective creativity of medieval architecture. Some drains emptied directly into moats or water channels, turning the sanitation system into an unwitting biological tool. Food, although abundant, was rarely tasty. Fresh meat was usually reserved for the nobility. But all of this served a purpose, maintaining the castle as a fortress where survival was always tied to strategy, discipline, and constant tension. When winter arrived, all inconveniences were magnified. Cold winds blew through gaps, dark and narrow corridors became nearly impassable, and the warmth from the hearth spread very limitedly. Every activity became a challenge. Moving from the great hall to the bedroom, from the kitchen to the watchtower, was a physical and mental journey. Lords, even atop towers, still felt pressure from both outside and within the castle. Anxiety over invaders, discontent among subordinates, and dangers lurking in every stone and door. For invaders, life outside the fortress was a series of continual failures. Entire armies faced a multi-layered defense system: moats, fortified gates, drawbridges, thick walls, arrow slits, and murder holes. Every wall under attack had additional internal defenses, forcing them to repeat every effort, from breaking gates with hammers, climbing ladders, to testing siege engines. Trebuchets built to topple walls from a distance turned breaching the fortress into a complex physics problem. Angles of launch, counterweight mass, projectile velocity all had to be calculated meticulously. Despite strong efforts, besieging forces were often thwarted by auxiliary tactics from within, from pouring boiling oil and hot sand to unexpected secondary walls. Sieges lasting months or even years were not only physical battles, but psychological wars. Hunger, fatigue, and stress became unofficial weapons. While defenders gradually grew gaunt but more aggressive, invaders had to learn to balance patience with despair. Often, it was starvation rather than weapons or technique that determined the final outcome. Yet every failure inspired improvement. Wall layouts, staircase designs, tower positions, and defensive tactics were tested and refined through each siege. This was a race between intellect, skill, and mathematics, where every stone, every angle, and every arrow slit was carefully considered to make the fortress nearly impregnable. From the outside, medieval castles were majestic, tall walls, fluttering flags, symbols of power and authority. Inside, reality was completely different: cold, damp, noisy, and chaotic. The Great Hall served both as a banquet space and a temporary battlefield. Hearths were cramped, slits tiny, toilets scattered throughout the castle, all creating a challenging living experience. Every moment, from moving through narrow corridors to observing enemies from the watchtower, was a lesson in dexterity, patience, and adaptability. Towers, corridors, and great halls were not merely architectural structures. They were evidence of intelligence, creativity, and the ultimate survival skills of humans in an era where power was intertwined with both fear and relentless effort. Each stone, each step, and each opening told a story of the people who lived, fought, and sometimes died within the very walls they built. A vivid lesson in strategy, psychology, and the unyielding perseverance of the medieval world. The Renaissance transformed castles, once symbols of fear and warfare, into palaces of power, luxury, and display. Walls were no longer built thick to stop catapults or protect against invaders, but to assert status and authority in the eyes of others. Massive walls were now adorned with tapestries, curtains, and artworks, causing candlelight and fireplace glow to reflect in ways both shimmering and majestic. This was how lords turned survival into a subtle declaration of style, where power was no longer measured by stone and iron, but by taste, wealth, and aesthetic control. While great halls were once centers of chaos, where dogs ran free, guards clanged their weapons, and servants shouted amid smoke and fire, they became places for lavish festivities. Tables and chairs were carefully arranged, food abundant and artfully presented, while music from refined instruments replaced shouting and hammering. Central hearths radiated warmth throughout the hall, no longer warming only a few feet around, making the space pleasant and livable. Thick carpets covering walls and floors not only insulated, but emphasized the lord's ability to possess and control beauty at will. Every detail, from grand chandeliers to stained glass windows, conveyed a message. This was a place where power, wealth, and refinement converged. Even bedrooms and watchtowers changed similarly. Rooms once cold, cramped, and infested with rats were now fitted with wooden floors, functional windows, and luxurious furnishings. Defensive towers, once posts for guards, became resting places decorated with curtains, soft beds, and spectacular views of the fields. Arrow slits were widened to admit light rather than shoot arrows at enemies, harmonizing every perspective aesthetically. Spaces that were once boiling oil pits or murder holes became gardens, fountains, or elegant tea areas. These transformations were not merely functional, they represented a shift in mindset, from defense to display, from fear to soft power. Yet behind the splendor, traces of wartime remained. Some lords retained fake walls, decorative arrow slits, and ornate killing pits, not for defense, but to send the message, I could still protect my property and power if necessary. The combination of reality and symbolism turned the castle into a stage where power was expressed through form, material, and aesthetics. People, though no longer fleeing under boiling oil, still felt the weight of this emblematic power. Every wall, tower, and window reminded them of social hierarchy, wealth, and that obedience was the only way to survive within the social order. The Renaissance also introduced amenities that medieval times could not imagine. Kitchens expanded, no longer serving the military but hosting lavish banquets. Imported wines, exquisite pastries, and roasted meats were served artistically, turning once chaotic great halls into spaces for celebration and display. Spiral wooden staircases were no longer physical challenges but elegant architectural features. Drawbridges and portcullises, once tools of war, became decorative elements, evoking power while enhancing aesthetics. Notably, this transformation also contained profound tactical intelligence. With the advent of gunpowder and cannons posing real threats, the thick medieval walls became obsolete. Rather than building uselessly thick walls, architects devised defensive measures using earth, gardens, and decorative barriers, blending physical protection with symbolic authority. Castles were no longer merely war fortresses. They became fortresses of taste, refined power, and social status. This evolution demonstrated that human intellect could transform fear and chaos into art, turning stones and bricks into symbols of aesthetic authority. Yet castles did not entirely lose their former nature. Gray stones still retained the breath of the past: paranoia, tension, and absolute power. These walls told stories across centuries, from the fear of war to lavish feasts, from the toil of peasants to the ostentation of the nobility. They reminded us that power, in any form, is always a delicate balance between actual strength and the ability to project authority. Castles were vivid proof that architecture serves not only function, but also as a means to control, display, and educate society. Finally, castles became timeless symbols. With the rise of modern armies, when cannons could destroy walls in hours, once majestic fortresses became ruins or luxurious new constructions, simultaneously palaces and cultural heritage sites. They taught future generations lessons of perseverance, intellect, and adaptability. The stones remain, but they are no longer barriers. They are reminders that human power, creativity, and spirit transcend all challenges. Castles transformed from survival tools into artistic symbols, from war fortresses into fortresses of style, and from fear into emblems of spiritual strength and social status. The extravagance of Roman feasts was not mere indulgence, it was a weapon, a sophisticated political tool. Every cup of wine, every imported dish, every meticulously presented delicacy sent a subtle message. Whoever controlled the table controlled relationships, power, and information. Um, Guests, no matter how powerful, had to follow protocol, read the host and the other guests. A misplaced smile, a careless remark, or a late wine cup could destabilize your status in an instant. The triclinium, the luxurious dining room where senators and nobles gathered, was not merely a place to eat. It was a stage where power was expressed through detail, subtlety, and the ability to balance pleasure and decorum. The dishes, extravagant to the point that many modern people can hardly imagine, served both to flaunt wealth and to test guests' reactions. Flamingo tongues, sea urchins, even dormice coated in honey were not just flavors, they were challenges, tests of adaptability, refinement, and cultural knowledge. The host demonstrated power by selecting dishes and arranging seating. Trusted allies sat nearby, the less influential sat farther away, and political rivals had to navigate carefully to maintain face. Every detail mattered, from the arrangement of the table to the light from oil lamps, from the colors of draperies to the instruments playing in the room. A Roman feast was therefore a sophisticated symphony of power, knowledge, and display where pleasure was used as a tool of social control. But it was not only the food, the art of communication was also essential. Guests did not merely eat, they observed, evaluated, and influenced one another. A skillful compliment could strengthen alliances, a subtle remark could undermine a rival. Roman senators and nobles had to balance pleasure and decorum, enjoy without losing control, know when to remain silent and when to speak. Even a smile, a glance, or a nod carried strategic significance. In this context, feasting became a political arena where every action had consequences. Ancient historians such as Pliny, Tacitus, and Suetonius recorded these extravagant feasts, but not always accurately in the simplest sense. Many stories of decadence, debauchery, or excessive indulgence were embellished to highlight moral failures or the cruelty of emperors. Caligula, Nero, Elagabalus, these names are often associated with licentious knights, but mostly through the lens of political opponents, writers, and senators seeking to diminish their reputation. Therefore, in reality, Roman feasts, though lavish, were often more serious than we imagine, serving as venues to build alliances, debate knowledge, and consolidate power. Pleasure was used strategically as part of the art of leadership and social management. Extravagance was not absolute freedom, but a tool to reinforce order and display authority. Guests had to demonstrate self-control, civility, and discernment, while the host exhibited power through the ability to organize and control the space. A feast not only reflected wealth, but revealed a subtle hierarchy. Who sat near the emperor, who sat farther, who received the finest dishes. From marble floors to imported spices, every detail conveyed a message of power. Even wine, a symbol of Roman refinement, carried both pleasure and surveillance. Too much could reveal secrets, too little could offend guests. Notably, although extravagance may mislead modern observers into thinking Roman society was indulgent, most feasts remained within the bounds of discipline and authority. They were not merely moments of decadence, they were foundations for maintaining alliances, controlling relationships, and demonstrating intellect. Even small details, like serving wine at the right moment or maintaining proper seating, had deep political significance. A minor complaint, a careless act, could affect social standing or political career. In this context, pleasure became strategy. Enjoyment was balanced with discipline, indulgence accompanied by power. Roman feasts, from lavish imperial banquets to modest dinners of senators, were sophisticated displays of power. The host controlled every detail, from food, drink, and seating to music and lighting. Guests, regardless of wealth, had to follow rules and read the environment. Every glance, smile, and gesture was observed and evaluated. Since ancient times, Roman feasts were part of soft politics, a space where power, pleasure, and intellect intertwined. And like medieval castles, Roman feasts were also proof of human creativity and ingenuity. They demonstrated that power was not based solely on violence, but on the art of communication, image control, and the ability to read others. In this context, extravagance was not merely for display. It was a strategy, a sophisticated tool, and an indispensable part of the power system. While the Roman elite reclined on soft silk cushions, sipping wine and conversing under the shimmering light of oil lamps, a team of slaves stood motionless, pouring wine, clearing dishes, and quietly overseeing every detail. For them, feasting was not merely pleasure, it was submission, strict discipline. Every action, whether the slave's calm composure, the effort to maintain balance, or the speed of serving wine, directly reflected the host's prestige and power. It was precisely the efficiency, elegance, and skill in service that created the perfect image the host wished to convey. A Roman feast, therefore, was not just a meal. It was a ritual, an arena where power was displayed, alliances formed, and even the future of families could be determined without a single sword drawn. Every toast, every dish, every glance carried ambition, desire, and the struggle for survival within the glittering web of imperial power. For the ruling class, pleasure was not mere self-indulgence. It was the art of performing power, where wealth was used as a strategic tool. Lavish dining was a declaration of status among the powerful, and every detail, from the attire of the guests to the rarity of the dishes, was carefully considered. Even the scent of incense and perfumes was part of the power play, signaling refinement and authority while shaping the atmosphere, compelling everyone to participate in an invisible performance. Emperors, senators, and wealthy patrons understood that their reputation was built not only on the political forum, but also at the dining table. A Roman feast was a perfect stage where the art of entertaining intertwined with the art of manipulation. The host could convey messages of wealth, restraint, generosity, and power through table arrangements, choice of dishes, and even through the glances or gestures of the attending slaves. Too modest, and the host appeared weak. Too ostentatious, and gossip about decadence could spread across the city like wildfire. Nero, the emperor later remembered as a symbol of indulgence and theatricality, exemplifies this delicate balance. Initially, his feasts amazed Rome with music, poetry, art, and innovation. He encouraged artistic creativity, surrounding himself with elites, from musicians to poets, creating an atmosphere both magnificent and complex. But as Nero's paranoia and personal ambition grew, the feasts gradually became displays of power, fear, and subtle control. Guests understood that a single wrong word could turn a lavish evening into public humiliation, or worse, a threat to life itself. Laughter, assent, or even a glance was carefully read. Beneath the surface of pleasure lay a political arena where loyalty and intelligence were tested at every moment. Noblewomen, often underestimated by male historians, played crucial roles in these gatherings. Their charm, intellect, and influence could elevate a family or destroy a rival, turning the table into a sophisticated network of power. For many Romans, however, pleasure was also a path to sacred connection. Feasts provided opportunities to honor the gods, display abundance, and affirm cosmic order through intricate rituals. The balance between pleasure and morality became part of social order, yet the line between the sacred and the sinful was easily blurred. One guest sought refinement, another sought release. Every action, every dish, every glance carried profound meaning. When Caesar or Caligula assumed power, Rome expected a Caesar Augustus, one who would restore order and respect tradition. Instead, they received an emperor whose extravagant feasts became notorious symbols of madness and absolute power. Caligula's feasts were not merely for culinary enjoyment, they were political performances where power, fear, and pleasure intertwined. Guests reclining under gilded ceilings, inhaling perfumed air, witnessing fountains of wine flow, and tasting rare dishes, brains, flamingo tongues, vinegar soaked pearls, were all staged to demonstrate the emperor's divinity. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio depicted these scenes as decadence, but their political essence was clear. Each feast was a test of loyalty, an examination of intellect and the ability to read power. Guests who refused dishes or hesitated to praise the emperor's performance risked offense, while excessive flattery could invite ridicule. Survival demanded precision and alertness, turning feasts into subtle arenas where power was asserted and paranoia controlled. Under Nero, the Roman feast became an art stage where guests were both audience and prop. He performed, recited poetry, sang, and staged spectacular dramas. The lavish dishes were mere surface. True attention focused on power and the ability to manipulate the emotions, loyalty, and devotion of those around him. Music, light, fragrance, and performance art combined to create a comprehensive experience where pleasure became a tool of power and political art. If Caligula turned feasts into weapons, Nero transformed them into stages where art, desire, and power merged. These feasts demonstrate that in Roman society, power was asserted not only through the sword or the throne, but also through the subtle control of pleasure, extravagance, and the ability to manipulate others' behavior. Here, art and politics became one, and pleasure was used to instruct, warn, and even punish. If Nero turned the feast into a stage of power, Elagabalus took it to an entirely different level, where the boundaries between the divine, pleasure, and politics almost vanished. Ascending the throne at just 14 years old, this young emperor brought to Rome a flamboyant spirituality that left the elite both awed and fearful. As the high priest of the god Elagabalus made no distinction between religious ritual and worldly pleasure. For him, feasting was a sacred ceremony where devotion, ecstasy, and spectacular display intertwined to the point that guests could hardly discern holiness from hedonism. Elagabalus's feasts quickly became legendary, recounted by ancient writers with tales of exotic, luxurious dishes that astonished even seasoned nobles. Camel heels, ostrich brains, pearls dissolved in vinegar. Each detail was not merely for shock value, but reflected the emperor's absolute power, his ability to orchestrate and control every aspect of the experience. Ceilings were strewn with so many flower petals that many were said to suffocate, a spectacle that left conservative officials both amazed and outraged. Elagabalus sought not only to flaunt wealth, but also to disrupt rigid social norms. He seated senators alongside performers, soldiers, and foreign priests, turning traditional gatherings into chaotic festivals. Yet behind this chaos lay a strange philosophy. Elagabalus believed pleasure could be sacred. He surrounded himself with beauty, art, and emotion, convinced that such ecstasy honored the gods who created them. However, Rome was unprepared for such extravagant devotion. What Elagabalus considered religious ecstasy, the public saw as madness. He replaced statues of Jupiter with his own divine symbols, married multiple times, and invited women and powerful figures to key positions at court. For the conservative senators, these actions were not only irrational, but a direct challenge to traditional order. His feasts became symbols of disorder, with an emperor too young, too unfamiliar, and too reckless to maintain control. Elagabalus's downfall was swift. In 222 CE, the Praetorian Guard turned against him, ending both his reign and his illusory feasts. Yet his legacy endured. For centuries, writers used his name as a symbol of decadence pushed to the brink of madness. But separating rumor from reality, Elagabalus may have been merely a dreamy emperor, confusing sacred revelry with divine authority, whose pursuit of beauty led him into oblivion. Stories of the decadence of Roman emperors, from Caligula to Elagabalus, continue to captivate the imagination for centuries. But careful study shows that much of the information comes from historians writing long after the events, with biases and moralizing intent. They were not direct witnesses, but commentators, using the emperor's indulgence to illustrate moral lessons. Accusations of gluttony, sexual depravity, or cruelty were often character assassinations, turning individuals into symbols responsible for all of Rome's crises. Archaeology presents a gentler picture. Villas at Pompeii and Herculaneum show dining rooms designed for conversation and relaxation, not chaos. Frescoes and artifacts such as glass, brass, and finely crafted silver indicate that aesthetics and decorum were as important as cuisine. The Roman elite still favored luxury, but as a demonstration of culture, status, and generosity, not debauchery. They collected spices from Arabia, silk from China, and wine from distant provinces, all to build image and power, more like modern diplomatic feasts than orgiastic ceremonies. Much of the misunderstanding stems from later translation and the perspectives of Christian writers. The Greek word orior referred to religious rituals involving music, dance, and emotion, but early Christian authors turned it into a symbol of sin and indulgence. Through the Middle Ages, Roman feasting was depicted as a miniature of moral decay, entirely divorced from its original political, social, and spiritual context. In reality, Roman feasts were complex social rituals blending politics, spirituality, and art. They reflected a delicate balance between pleasure and power, where every action, glance, and dish was carefully considered. After the fall of the empire, the story of Rome continued to evolve, turning emperors into cautionary symbols for future generations. Caligula became a symbol of arrogance, Nero an image of vanity, and Elagabalus embodied sacrilege and excessive dreaming. Feasts, therefore, were not merely about pleasure or debauchery. They were mirrors reflecting a civilization where power, art, and spirituality intertwined. They teach that pleasure, when used as a political tool or entwined with the self, can be dangerous, yet it also reveals intelligence, refinement, and subtle control in a complex society. Through these lavish Roman feasts, Rome remains vivid, not just as the city of sin and legend, but as a culture capable of transforming pleasure into art, power, and ritual, offering profound insight into humanity, society, and the complexities of authority. If in Rome the feast was both a ritual and a symbol of power, in Northern Europe, the human body became the foundation of a sophisticated language, where story, belief, and identity intertwined in every line and curve. When Ahmad ibn Fadlan encountered Northern European merchants and witnessed Viking women adorned and decorated from fingertips to neck in deep blues and greens, he did not merely see beauty. He saw a culture, a nonverbal language etched onto flesh. Their tattoos, spirals, and bodily markings were not simply decorations. They were stories, beliefs, power, and heritage recorded in ink and artistry, transcending time. In Viking society, these designs carried complex layers of meaning. Every spiral, circle, or coiled serpent motif symbolized the cycle of life, transformation, and the connection between humans and the divine. Blue, often made from ash, soot, or ground copper salts, was associated with endurance, divinity, and wisdom. Green, linked to the goddess Freya, represented fertility, love, and beauty. Through these symbols, Viking women not only expressed themselves but also affirmed their relationship with the divine, family, and lineage. Each tattoo was a living message, a story read through gaze and respect rather than speech. Viking tattoos held both communal and personal significance. They could mark important life milestones, coming of age ceremonies, marriages, childbirth, or even funerals, like chapters in a personal chronicle etched upon the skin. Runes, sacred characters, were often integrated into the designs, symbolizing power, protection, or connection with the gods. A serpent coiled around an arm could be a plea for Midgard's protection. A Thor's hammer symbol on the shoulder or wrist was a declaration of strength and courage. Even the placement of tattoos carried meaning. Hands and forearms reflected skill and authority. The neck, chest, or shoulders marked deep beliefs and loyalty. In a society where written texts and records were limited, the skin became a living repository of memory and tradition. Every knot, spiral, or motif bore witness to lineal voyage or a pivotal family event. The body was no longer an empty ornament. It became a spiritual and cultural map. Viking women, through their tattoos, carried stories of ancestors, divine protection, and life milestones, creating a form of tangible memory that endured even as the world around them changed. Beyond symbolism, these tattoos also served aesthetic and social functions. They expressed personal power, refinement, and self control, similar to how Romans used elaborate dining tables and decorated halls to assert status and taste. Vikings believed that beauty was not vanity, but strength, faith, and endurance. A body adorned with meticulous tattoos reflected resilience, intellect, courage, and connection to communal values. Through every spiral and rune, Viking women demonstrated that they were both preservers of culture and bearers of tradition and belief. In this way, body art became a social ritual. It recalls Roman feasts, where every detail from food to music was carefully orchestrated to create a cohesive experience. In Northern Europe, the body was a living feast, where messages, history, and beliefs were displayed to those around without words. Each tattoo was a work of art, a declaration of identity, and a medium to communicate with the divine. Archaeology, though limited because skin does not endure, has uncovered evidence of tattooing tools, pigments, and decorative objects mimicking skin patterns. These findings confirm that tattooing among Viking women was not isolated but widespread. Tattoos existed as a means to preserve tradition and educate the next generation about belief, power, and skill in daily life. The lines carved into wood, metal, or stone in burial sites reflected how they recorded personal stories on skin, creating a network of memory preserved in physical space. These tattoos, like Roman feasts, were where beauty, power, and the divine met. They remind us that art, whether on the table or on the body, is never merely entertainment. It is a means to tell stories, record history, and reinforce social values. The power of Viking tattoos lies in their ability to endure across time, reflecting spirit, identity, and belief, a way for humans to express themselves and pass on heritage to future generations. Through these two cultures, Roman and Northern European, we see that art and ritual are always intertwined with power, belief, and identity. Whether a lavish feast or sacred tattoo, they reflect a civilization that knew how to balance pleasure, morality, and authority. And it is through the subtlety, meaning, and communicative power of these symbols that their cultural legacy has endured for millennia, transcending time and the distortions of history. If tattoos are a language, then for Viking women, they are an epic written on flesh and ink, where every mark, every rune contains faith, power, and memory. The upside down Y shaped rune, Algis, is not merely a drawing, it is a spiritual shield, an invisible plea against misfortune, protecting its bearer from dangers unseen by the eye. Fahu symbolizes wealth and prosperity, while Bakana, the birch leaf, signifies fertility and renewal, a reminder that life constantly turns and is reborn according to its own cycles. Tattooing these symbols is not mere decoration, it is a ritual, a way to connect the physical world with the divine, a bridge between life, death, and unseen forces. The tattooing process, as described by Fedlin, was far from simple. Vikings drove ink into the skin using soot, charcoal, sometimes mixed with resin or oil, turning the body into a living hymn. This was not vanity, it was endurance transformed into devotion. The woman chose the ink, chose the pain and patience to transform suffering into a sacred symbol. In Norse belief, pain was not merely a personal trial, but also a way to connect with the divine, like Odin, the supreme god, who harmed himself on the world tree Yggdrasil to gain wisdom. Each prick of the needle on the skin was a reminder that sacrifice and resilience yield power beyond time. Each tattoo was a vow, a mark of belonging. Whether small or intricate, it endured longer than words, engraving faith and commitment onto the body itself. In the Viking world, faith did not reside solely in temples or statues. It lived in gestures, charms, daily symbols, and on women's skin. A tattoo became armor, protecting the wearer from invisible dangers, illness, and even death at sea. In a society where nature and the ocean constantly threatened peril, carrying a divine mark was a silent yet powerful act, a pledge to the gods that the spirit would not be consumed by winter or war. Many Viking tattoos were inspired directly by mythology. The coiled serpent symbolized Jormungandr, the world serpent, encircling the earth, representing protection through eternal vigilance. Spiderweb motifs recalled the three Norns who wove the fate of all beings. These marks were not merely decoration, they were sacred acknowledgments, a way for Viking women to carry divinity with them daily. Some symbols were associated with specific gods. Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, appeared through the falcon or cat, sacred animals. Thor appeared in the form of Mjolnir, the hammer, a protective emblem against evil forces. Odin, with the Valknut, three interlocking triangles, was used to seek wisdom, courage, or a peaceful death. Each symbol was a prayer in the language of runes, where meaning, purpose, and consequence intertwined. Tattooing, therefore, was not merely art, but ritual. The woman performing it often fasted, recited chants, or prayed to ancestors, creating a process that connected body, spirit, and the divine world. The tattooing ritual was also linked to key life moments, childbirth, voyages, funerals, helping the woman feel protected by unseen forces. Each tattoo was a covenant, a promise between humans and gods that faith would endure even as the body returned to the earth. Tattooing was not merely an art. It was a living declaration recording power, belief, and personal identity. Viking tattoo art was inseparable from daily life. Designs on the skin often mirrored carvings on ships, jewelry, or homes, creating a continuous thread connecting art, culture, and belief. Spirals symbolized continuity and rebirth, while runes connected humans to gods or ancestors. Hands, arms, and necks displayed strength, faith, and courage, proudly exhibited without explanation. The Vikings' extensive trade network allowed tattoo art to extend beyond Scandinavia, interacting with techniques and symbols from Slavs, Turks, and Arabs. Through this exchange, tattooing became an international reflection, where identity, faith, and art converged under the needle. Each artisan, though anonymous, left a silent legacy, a reminder that the most valuable stories are not only spoken but also etched onto flesh. Runes were an alphabet, a divine bridge. The Futhark, a simplified version of runes used in the Viking era, represented both sound and concept. Fehu symbolized material and spiritual wealth. Algis was a protective shield. Berkana for fertility and motherhood. Tiwaz, the arrow-shaped rune, evoked justice and sacrifice. Carving runes was a veneration of the divine, a demonstration of reverence and faith. A woman tattooing runes on her wrist might pray for safe childbirth. On her forearm, a seaweed symbol would protect her during voyages. Choosing the symbol and placement was a respectful decision, where each stroke resonated with unseen worlds. Odin, in mythology, also endured suffering to uncover the secrets of runes, reminding that tattooing was a miniature act of sacrifice, enduring short-term pain in exchange for power and wisdom. These tattoos were both talismans and social markers reflecting loyalty, faith, skill, and personal status. They existed as reminders of the connection between humans, gods, and the natural world, making the body a living record of Viking culture, belief, and history. Viking women did not merely bear individual runes on their skin, but complex combinations forming talismans and living stories. These bound runes, discovered by archaeologists in Scandinavian artifacts, were not just letters, but threads connecting fate. They intertwined into shapes resembling vines or snowflakes, both aesthetic and powerful, serving as protection and as language. Although very few physical tattoos have survived, relics made of stone, wood, and jewelry reveal the visual vocabulary Viking women used. Each mark carried its own meaning, chosen and executed with reverence, patience, and awareness of the power it conferred. Ink on the skin was not merely color, it was a bridge between flesh and fate, between the tangible and the invisible. Each tattoo was a spell, a story inscribed on the body. Not all were for war or worship. Some arose from the quiet pain of love and memory. In a society where death was ever present and separation inevitable, tattoos became signs of endurance, reminders that love and memory could transcend time and space. For women with husbands, fathers, or sons potentially lost at sea, each mark under the skin was a promise that affection would endure even if the body did not. Delicate network patterns symbolized eternal bonds, endless loops reflecting the belief that souls would remain connected across lifetimes. Pairs of birds, perhaps ravens or swans, told stories of separated lovers, one flying across the sea, the other waiting beneath the northern sky, while a winding line from wrist to heart signified fidelity, a secret known only to the wearer. Northern love was neither gentle nor sentimental. It was intense, faithful, and tragic. Legends abound with stories of women waiting decades for warriors to return or vowing revenge for fallen husbands. Tattoos became the silent extension of those vows. Some runes invoked Freya, goddess of love and beauty, while other symbols were associated with Odin's ravens, linking affection with wisdom and memory. Carving these symbols was both a prayer and an act of resistance, a devout response to unavoidable loss. Death and love in Viking life always went hand in hand. During funerary rituals, women might renew or add tattoos, transforming grief into memory. The pain of the needle mirrored the pain of loss, connecting emotional wounds to the body so both could heal, leaving scars that endured through time. Even the smallest tattoo carried spiritual weight, symbolizing love, loyalty, and remembrance. In a culture that feared being forgotten, tattooing was an act of engraving emotion, ensuring that love would persist despite the passage of years. But Viking tattoos were not only associated with family or affection. Many northern women were merchants, travelers, and negotiators, carrying their culture and values beyond Scandinavia. Marks on the skin also reflected commerce, prosperity, and worldly connections. The Viking era spanned from the icy fjords of Norway to bustling markets in Baghdad, Constantinople, and the Caspian Sea. Women participated in and sometimes led trading ventures, managing exchanges of furs, amber, iron, and even slaves. Tattoos became a means of silent communication, signaling faith, origin, and reliability. A female merchant with blue ink could be recognized instantly, serving as a badge of honor and a message: I come from the north, where honor and courage are esteemed. Motifs related to the sea, waves, ships, spirals, symbolized voyages, survival, and prosperity. Some imitated longship carvings believed to ward off evil spirits, while spirals represented tides, cycles of wealth, and fortune. Cultural exchanges also left their mark. Encounters with Arab, Persian, or Turkic artisans introduced new aesthetic values into Northern art, creating a fusion of Northern mysticism and Eastern craftsmanship. Tattoos carried social and spiritual significance, representing both economic ambition and divine favor from sea gods and protective goddesses. Some women also participated in raids, defended settlements, or accompanied relatives on voyages. Tattoos became symbols of endurance, strength, and identity in a life where survival was an art. As in the story of Lagertha, the legendary shield maiden who fought alongside men with both cunning and ferocity, tattoos became dual symbols. Spirals around the arm represented cycles of combat and rebirth, while a wolf's head on the shoulder symbolized Odin's warrior, fearless and invincible. Unlike merchant motifs, warrior tattoos carried ritual significance. Tiwaz symbolized courage, algis was defense, silo represented victory. Ink was often made from soot and ash from sacred fires or burnt weapons, making the tattoos both physical and spiritual talismans. Wearing them bound one to fate, connecting to the invisible thread the Norns had spun for humanity. Women travelers inscribed longships or Odin's ravens, marking journeys as well as experience. Each inked line was a compass, a confession, and living proof. She had crossed the seas, faced chaos, and returned. Tattoos were not rebellion or decoration. They were declarations of presence, silent shields, sacred and resilient as the northern seas. Although archaeology no longer finds them on skin, tools, artifacts, and legends still recall the power, faith, emotion, and identity these marks once conveyed. Under the gray, cloud-filled skies of the Adriatic, Uria became a land where fate and ambition intersected, where every decision by King Gentius could create or destroy the freedom of an entire nation. An alliance with Perseus of Macedon was not merely a strategic choice, but also a test of the will, faith, and leadership ability of the young king. While the Urian chieftains had long been divided over power, they now had to look to Gentius as the sole pillar of unity. The rugged coastline, narrow bays, and rocky straits became natural barriers, yet no wall could stop the Roman legions heading this way. Each Urian ship cutting through the waves symbolized the will to survive, and every sailor on deck carried in their heart the pride and responsibility of defending their homeland. Gentius not only strengthened the navy, he also rebuilt the entire government structure. Tribal leaders who had long resisted central authority now had to pledge loyalty to the court. He applied discipline, but also distributed power skillfully, avoiding immediate rebellion. In strategic meetings, Gentius demonstrated the acumen of a leader who understood that every alliance, however fragile, needed to be nurtured with both trust and strength. Roman and Greek envoys carried threats and promises, yet Gentius did not rush to choose sides. Instead, he observed, measured power, and prepared for the golden moment. when patience and strategy combined to create maximum advantage. Within his realm, Gentius faced equally formidable challenges. Tribal leaders viewed him with suspicion. Many believed that an alliance with Macedon was reckless, that Rome would not forgive, that Scadra was merely a path to destruction. But Gentius believed Iria had no other choice. Dependence on foreign powers meant the loss of sovereignty, and he was determined to turn the small kingdom into the final shield against Rome, while creating a power axis strong enough to withstand any invasion. The Urian fleet became a living symbol of this determination. The longships, adorned with dragon heads and warrior motifs, served not only for battle but also sent a message. This is Iria, a nation that does not bow. Every sailor, from the young to the seasoned warrior, understood that they were writing history with blood and sweat. As the ships cut through the Adriatic waves, they carried both the king's oath and the loyalty of the people, a clear message to both Rome and Macedon. Iria would not fall easily. For Gentius, the alliance with Perseus was not merely strategy, but a subtle exchange between power and survival. Perseus, the last king of the Antigonid dynasty, needed Iria as a distraction to divert Rome's attention. Gentius needed Macedon for wealth and military support. This relationship was not built on friendship or trust, but on necessity. From this necessity, Iria began to form a new identity, a nation daring to stand between two empires, using intelligence, strategy, and courage to preserve freedom. The early days of Gentius's reign, under the false calm of diplomacy, were truly days of quiet work. He not only expanded the fleet, but also stationed units along the river Din, fortified coastal strongholds, and built alliances with tribal leaders. Every measure was taken with careful consideration, strengthening central power while maintaining social stability. His leadership combined authority, intellect, and foresight, making every decision capable of triggering a ripple effect across the Adriatic. Yet the Adriatic was not only strategic, it was an economic lifeline and a survival test. Every voyage, every trade carried danger, pirates, storms, and threats from more powerful fleets. Gentius understood that to maintain freedom, Iria had to be both a warrior state and a cautious trade hub. Alliances, exchanges of goods, and merchant ships were all used as strategic tools, turning every resource into a weapon in the struggle for survival. In this context, Gentius's steadfastness and vision became a guiding star. He protected not only territory, but national pride. Every decision, from the fragile alliance with Macedon to consolidating internal power, was part of a long-term plan to create a unified Iria, strong enough to defend itself, yet maintaining autonomy. Roman merchants complained about pirates, tribal leaders doubted loyalty, and Rome sought reasons to intervene, yet Gentius remained resolute. Every action combined practical power with the aspiration to safeguard the homeland. When the alliance was formed, the Adriatic reverberated with the echoes of a new power. Urian ships filled sails and cut through the waves, while Roman and Greek envoys carried warnings and threats. But Gentius did not falter. He understood that freedom was not granted but seized. The sea, the straits, and the bays were battlefields, and each sailor, each ship was a declaration of loyalty, perseverance, and the will to survive. By 170 BCE, Iria stood at a historical crossroads. The alliance with Perseus of Macedon was a decisive move, signaling readiness to confront Rome. The two rulers shared a goal: protect their territories, maintain autonomy, and prevent the advance of the Mediterranean's most powerful empire. For Gentius, this was not merely a strategic alliance, but a symbol of faith, will, and resilience, proof that even small nations could stand firm amidst the currents of history. The failure of Gentius was not only the end of a kingdom, but also a vivid testament to the fragility of power and the ruthlessness of history. When the Urian warriors finally had to lower their flags, the once formidable fortresses and magnificent harbors became mere ruins in the eyes of the victors. Scadra, the mighty capital once protected by rivers and rugged mountains, now stood as a symbol of defeat. Cracked city walls, streets that had once bustled with life, fell silent, and the air was heavy with profound loss. The Urian people, from sailors to farmers, had to witness a sight they had never imagined: their kingdom falling into enemy hands. Their loyalty, pride, and hope were cruelly tested, as Rome not only occupied but also deployed a total control system, sowing fear and submission. Gentius, the king who once confidently stood between two empires, now found himself in absolute isolation. His pride, which had guided Uria through tense years, had become a bitter draught in captivity. He maintained regal composure, wearing his royal cloak and preserving his solemn demeanor. Yet in his mind, Gentius felt every strand of power that had bound the country gradually slip from his grasp. Each step on the streets of Rome, dragged along in a triumphal parade, reminded him that all efforts, plans, and hopes could be overturned in a single moment. His family, Queen Atuta and their son, also endured profound loss. For them, defeat meant more than the loss of power. It was the collapse of a familiar order where honor, tradition, and lineage were cherished. They witnessed the destruction of cultural symbols, from the fleet that once dominated the Adriatic to the war spoils containing memory and power. Every Roman action was not merely a military maneuver, but also a stripping away of identity and freedom, turning proud people into living proof of the Republic's might. Meanwhile, allies who had once promised to support Gentius were nowhere to be found. Perseus of Macedon, in whom Gentius had placed complete trust, sent no reinforcements and withheld all resources, leaving Uria in a mortal void. This betrayal not only exposed the fragility of political alliances, but also emphasized that in the ancient world, power and loyalty were often intertwined with calculation and opportunity. Gentius realized he had gambled on human trust, and the result was the heaviest defeat of his reign. Yet this failure also carried a profound human aspect. Gentius and the Urians had fought not merely for power or territory, but for honor, national pride, and the survival of cultural values nurtured over generations. Their courage, even knowing that Rome was a superior enemy, reflected the indomitable spirit that defined the Urian identity. Every stone in Skodra's walls, every tower along the coast, had to testify to the strength of a small but resilient kingdom. And when they were conquered, that strength did not entirely vanish. It lived on in the memory of the people and historical records, becoming a symbol of perseverance in adversity. Life in captivity at Spalatum in central Italy opened another chapter of trials. Gentius, born to lead and make decisions, had to accept helplessness, confined within four walls. The imprisonment, though not immediately fatal, was a subtle form of mental torment. He had to witness the flow of power, piece by piece, shift from his hands to Rome, to feel the despair of a king stripped of all means of action. Yet even in the darkest days, Gentius retained his spirit. He did not kneel, did not beg, maintaining regal composure, a symbol of will and honor, even in imprisonment. The failure of Uria and Gentius also served as a lesson in the pragmatism of ancient diplomacy and strategy. In a world where military and economic power determined fate, alliances based on trust without safeguards could become perilous. Rome, with its sophisticated organization, disciplined legions, and mobility, demonstrated that efficiency and discipline could overturn valiant but resource-limited efforts. Meanwhile, leaders like Gentius had to balance courage with caution, decisiveness with strategic calculation, an art whose lesson endured in the wake of his defeat. The image of Gentius and his family being taken from the Adriatic to Italy became a historical symbol of power transfer. Every wave, every gust of wind, every glance from the coastal people reflected the anguish of a conquered nation. Though Rome appeared courteous, that courtesy was a veneer of absolute power, designed to show that domination relied not only on force, but also on the ability to craft the image of victory, impose fear, and control the mind. Gentius, with pride and composure, became a living witness to Rome's power and the perseverance of those who dared to oppose fate. From that defeat, the story of Uria lived on. It became a lesson for future generations about the fragility of power, the value of loyalty and strategy, and the strength of spirit required to face adversity. Though the kingdom had fallen, memories of its cities, fleets, and Gentius's courage remained in historical records, oral traditions, and the writings of Roman and Greek historians. His failure did not obscure indomitable will. On the contrary, it underscored that even when power passes into others' hands, resilience and honor can endure across time. Ultimately, the story of Gentius and Uria is not merely one of war or diplomacy. It is a story of humanity, of pride and wisdom, of suffering and hope. It reminds us that power, no matter how great, always carries responsibility, and that faith, loyalty, and the ability to fight for ideals are values beyond measure in gold or weapons. And in every failure exists the seed of a lesson, of honor, and of history, elements that time cannot fade. Skodra, the city that had once been the heart of the kingdom of Uria, now became a living arena where ancient pride clashed with the overwhelming power of Rome. Within the thick stone walls, Gentius summoned the remaining commanders, soldiers, and tribal leaders who had not yet surrendered. The atmosphere was tense and suffocating, yet filled with determination. Everyone understood that this was not merely a battle to defend Skodra, but the final struggle to preserve the identity, traditions, and freedom of Uria. The sounds of footsteps on the fortress grounds, the clanging of swords, and the murmurs of the people created a symphony of urgency and courage. Gentius, with regal demeanor and sharp eyes, walked among the troops, inspiring them with reminders of the kingdom's history and the pride of their ancestors. He knew well that the Roman soldiers were not merely fighters, they were living symbols of a perfectly organized republic, trained to win through discipline, tactics, and ruthlessness. Yet Gentius also understood that even in the face of such power, the spirit of the Urians remained their strongest weapon. Pride in their kingdom, in the sea and the mountains, had been forged through generations, becoming a bond that no force could break. As the Roman legions advanced into the valley, their steps measured, red and gold banners fluttering, Skodra trembled with every rhythm. The people, from sailors to artisans, stood along the city walls, witnessing a scene they had never imagined. Their beloved kingdom preparing to confront the most powerful war machine in the Mediterranean. Gentius ordered the archers to fire from the towers, the infantry to deploy anti-invasion tactics, and ambush points to be arranged along access routes. Every action was carefully calculated, not only to inflict losses on Rome, but also to assert that Uria would never surrender easily. Day after day, the fighting was fierce. Roman assaults were blocked by deep ditches and treacherous mountain paths, but Uria's resources and supplies gradually dwindled. Gentius saw the exhausted but resilient faces of his soldiers, hands trembling yet unwilling to let go of their weapons. Each of them, whether sailor, farmer, or tribal warrior, understood that this was the final battle, the decisive fight for the honor of the entire nation. Such resilience forced the Roman envoys to acknowledge that Uria fought not only with strength, but also with indomitable spirit and faith in their leader. However, the immense pressure began to erode morale. Many tribes, once opposed to Gentius' centralization of power, now sought to protect their lives by secretly contacting Rome. They provided information on defenses, food reserves, and harbors in exchange for mercy. A part of the alliance, once built on trust and oaths, crumbled at the very moment it was needed most. Internal betrayal, combined with Rome's mechanical power and discipline, turned the battle into an inevitable tragedy. Yet Gentius did not surrender. He stood atop the highest wall, overlooking the Din and Buna rivers flowing through the city, reminding his soldiers that they were fighting for every street, every house, every memory of freedom. Queen Atuda and his brother Caravantius remained by his side, bolstering the morale of the troops. Their presence reminded everyone that this was not just a military battle, but a fight to protect family, kingdom, and the soul of Uria. As days of combat dragged on, resources dwindled further, and Rome's resolve grew stronger. Every bombardment, every deployment of elite troops, each advance crushed the remaining hope. The exhausted citizens watched each city gate breach, each watchtower fall into enemy hands. Yet even in the darkest hours, Gentius maintained his composure, neither kneeling nor begging, remaining a symbol of indomitability. Finally, when the main gate was breached, Gentius went to meet the Roman envoy, not as a warrior but as a fallen king. He still wore his royal cloak, his eyes sharp yet calm. His surrender was not only the end of resistance, but also a moment that displayed the dignity of a king in defeat. Rome seized the treasures, the fleet, and his family, but the spirit of Uria had not been erased. The Romans, with a degree of respect, acknowledged that they were not conquering a rebel, but a true king, a leader with honor and courage, even in defeat. The consequences rippled throughout the kingdom. The Urian throne was destroyed, territories were divided into districts governed by Roman officials or loyal leaders, and every trace of independence gradually vanished. The Urian navy was annihilated, ports became outposts, and the Adriatic Sea that once belonged to Uria became a Roman highway. Yet the memory of resilience and loyalty could not be destroyed. Songs of Gentius, of Uria's final stand, continued to resonate in the hearts of the people, inspiring future generations to resist oppression and loss. The failure of Gentius and the collapse of Uria became a vivid historical lesson on the fragility of power, the danger of betrayal, and the timeless spirit of defiance. Though the kingdom had vanished, the fighting spirit, pride, and memory of steadfast leadership endured, reminding that even in crushing defeat, honor and pride persist, transcending every battle, empire, and tragedy of history.